Well, okay, so next week is Easter. And one of the things I kind of want to ask everyone to do is I would like for all of us to find one person to invite next week. People are much more likely to come visit a church on Easter. So if every single one of us just found one person, just one, if you feel like you can do more than one, then go for it, okay? Look at your family, your friends, your coworkers, someone who doesn't have a church, someone who has gone to the church in the past, right? Just find one person. We want people to come here and see that we are a place of truth and love and that we have our doors wide open to anyone who wants to join us, who try to worship and please God. So if all of us just invite one person to come to Easter, and if they don't come, that's fine. You did a great job. Just invite one person. Please do that. Let's do that. So, as we worship the Lord this morning, I want us to direct our minds and hearts towards how we can give God glory in controlling our anger, in loving one another, and in resisting sin. This morning, we're going to focus on the story of Cain and Abel. And I might approach it a different part than we're typically looking at. What I really want to focus on is this conversation that God has with Cain. How God directly talks to Cain. God sees Cain in the midst of all this, and God directly talks to Cain. I want to look at the advice that God gives Cain, and how it's good advice, and how we can give the advice to others. You see, Adam and Eve, they introduced sin into this world. We've been looking at that, and how throughout the book of Genesis, what you see is the consequences of sin, and there are some grave consequences. But really, the first consequence you see in the Bible hits really close to home for Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve introducing sin, the concept of disobeying God. And it troubled them, right? It cast them out of the garden. It separated them from God. It troubled their relationship. It caused childbirth to be difficult. It caused hard work to be difficult, and all more. But the consequences continued. And one of the first visible consequences you see of sin is Cain and Abel. And I'm willing to bet that when Cain killed Abel, when Adam and Eve saw that one of their sons had died at the hands of another, maybe they thought to themselves, this is because we ate that fruit. That sin cost them a child. Cain and Abel are the first children we see in the Bible. Right? We see that Cain is a tiller of the soil. Abel is a shepherd. They both bring offerings to God, right? Cain, because he's a farmer, he brings harvest to God. And Abel, since he's a shepherd, he brings an animal to sacrifice to God, right? And God was pleased with Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's sacrifice. And so out of frustration, out of anger, out of all the negative emotions he felt, Cain killed Abel. Just as a small note, why was Cain's offering rejected? There are a lot of different theories, and I think the Bible may support maybe multiple. Did God tell Cain and Abel to offer? We don't see that, but that probably happened, right? Did Cain offer the wrong thing? Right? Because Cain brought fruit, vegetables, while Abel brought a living animal. Is that the problem? Is it because Cain didn't bring the best he had? In Genesis 4, it says that Abel brought the best he had, but it just says Cain brought fruits and vegetables. Is it because he didn't bring the best he had? Or was it just because that Cain was living a life outside of God's will? Because whenever we live outside of God's will, God does not accept our worship. Whatever the point may be, you see this situation. You see that Cain is upset. This is an example of what not to do. I want you to think about this, and I want you to kind of relate to this. He's an example of hate, sure, but he's an example of how jealousy can lead to worse things. I want you to see the path he takes as he goes to kill, that ends with killing his brother, because at the initial starting point, he's not murderous. So at this initial starting point, he's just mad, frustrated, angry, jealous, emotions that you and I know all about. The consequences of his actions caught up to him. He failed. And now he's mad at someone who succeeded even though they didn't do anything to him. He's mad at someone who really doesn't deserve the anger. Have you ever felt that? I know I have. I've been mad at someone who really didn't deserve it. But really, at the end of the day, he's just kind of maybe mad at himself. He's jealous. He wants to be in his position, right? He's mad at just not doing well. His frustration, his anger, and his jealousy are directed at a person who really doesn't deserve it, whether Cain realizes it or not. He's just overwhelmed with his emotions. And what happens in this chapter is utterly amazing to me. If you're not careful, you might miss it. In between Cain having his offering rejected and Cain murdering his brother, God talks to Cain. God literally has a conversation with him. Cain hears from the creator of the world. And in this small chat, I think it's just 3 verses, you see God's goodness, you see God's love, God's encouraging, but even a direct talk with God wasn't able to stifle Cain's anger. And I kind of want to dissect this small chat. And I want us to look at this as if God was talking to us when we're in the middle of those moments where we're frustrated, in those moments of temptation. Or I also want to look at how when someone is in Cain's situation, maybe we want to have this conversation with someone. I want us to look and consider the ideas of self-control, the ideas of controlling your anger, of jealousy. So let's read the verses that I want to focus on. It's Genesis chapter 4, verses 5, 6, and 7. So verse 5 kind of picks up on just God rejecting Cain's sacrifice. But for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. God had no regard. So Cain was angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." There's a lot in those verses, isn't there? First, just considering the idea that God had a conversation with Cain. I tell you, I mean, in all the kids' Bible classes I was in, this little detail kind of eluded me. And as I started reading Genesis, started reading my Bible more thoroughly, and I read Cain and Abel, I'm like, wow, he got a sit-down talk from God directly. See, and in God having a conversation with Cain in the middle of his trouble, what you really see is God's love. You know, we have this habit of always saying how God in the Old Testament is so mean and angry. God in the New Testament is so loving and kind. Let me tell you, that's not true. God is always loving. But in these Old Testament moments where God is going to punish people, and we got to look carefully, and you'll see in the details how patient God is, how loving He is. What is this? A little sibling conflict? Cain's just a little frustrated. God came to talk to Cain about just a little bit of rivalry, right? Cain's just having a bad day, and God comes and talks to him. And yet God kind of knows something more is going on. I mean, never think that God doesn't care about what's going on in your life. God does care. God sees when Cain is hurting. He sees when you're hurting. God sees when he's troubled. And even though no one else saw what was really going on, God does. It doesn't matter how small your issue is, God sees and He cares. The same God who rejected Cain's offering came here to comfort him. The same God who punishes Cain in the end also encouraged him, saying, "You can do it." Saying, "You got to win." Saying, "Why are you so mad? Think about this." Because even when God is disappointed in you, even when you failed God, He still loves you. And that's nice to know. See, I see this conversation that God is having with Cain, and you know what it really reminds me of? It reminds me of a dad talking to his son. It reminds me of a son who did wrong and he got punished, right? Sent off to his bedroom, right? Where he's not allowed to leave and he's not allowed to watch TV. He's just got to sit in his room and think about what he did. And then the dad walks in and he has this little fatherly advice to Cain, where he gives him a little bit of a warning, but also some encouragement, where he tries to explain to him, listen, what you did was wrong, but if you do what's right, you don't have to be in timeout. He's like, understand that you may end up doing worse things, and that's not what I want you to do. I read these words, and I just feel like love pours out of it. And you can place yourself in Cain's spot. When you're angry, when you're frustrated, when you're jealous, when you're self-loathing, when you're disappointed, all of those emotions, right? God is here, seeing, listening, supporting. When you find yourself here, remember God's word. Remember the words that you read in your Bible. Remember stories like this. Remember what you've memorized or what you can remember. When you're in a situation like this, listen to the voice of God. And when you find people in situations like this, be the voice of God. Tell people, be the person here like God's trying to be for Cain. Be the person here who listens, who sees their hurt, who is there being gentle and supportive, but also giving a little bit of a warning, right? Because God isn't rebuking Cain. God kind of already did that in not accepting his sacrifice, but God instead is trying to come to Cain and trying to say to Cain, listen, you can do better. God wants Cain to succeed, and that's how we need to help people. We want them to succeed, and when you see someone struggling, go to them and support them like God does here. And so when you look at these words, think about it when you're tempted. Think about it when you see someone else who's tempted. Because he starts off here with just this necessary, you can call it a rhetorical question. First, notice that comfort. Notice how God sees his pain, right? God notices when we hurt. See, Cain is angry, his face is fallen, he's hanging his head low. And anger and sadness are really just forms of emotional pain. They're people hurting. And there's this comfort in God saying, God acknowledging his pain. He says, Cain, I see you're angry. I see that you're hanging your head. I see that you're sad. Right? And there's so much comfort in someone just acknowledging our hurt, isn't there? And here, God is going to say, I see your pain, but he's also going to say how to respond to the pain, how to guide yourself, how to react constructively in a godly way. When you're feeling this anger and emotion, how do you respond? Because often humans, we don't respond well, do we? You see this with Cain. We don't respond well when we are hurt. But God is coming to him and saying, listen, I know you're hurting, but this is how you need to respond. Cain is going to fall victim to his anger. And really, his anger is stemming from jealousy. His negative emotions come from the consequences of his bad behavior. And his bad behavior really stems from his wrong beliefs. He believed God will be okay with anything I give him. And so he gave a bad offering. And so then he was upset when God rejected it. Right? And so it starts with our beliefs, leading to our behavior, leading to our emotions. Cain would have felt very happy if he had done what was right. He would have done what is right if he had remembered and believed that he has to do what is right before God. When God isn't pleased, he was jealous and angry. And when we think about just these concepts, right? Jealousy, Jealousy. Where does jealousy come from? Jealousy comes from not being content. Jealousy comes from something you don't have, but you want. Jealousy comes from not being grateful and thankful. Jealousy makes you focus on something else. Makes you really focus on your desire for something else. And the more you focus on yourself or your desire, really the less you're able to focus on God. And so jealousy, just that weakness of our humanity, Hebrews 13:5 says, be content with what you have, because if you're jealous, that's going to ruin your life. It's going to cause you to do bad things. It's going to cause you to feel bad ways, right? And so situations like Cain and Abel are why God put into the Ten Commandments, don't be jealous. Like we know all those, let me think. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. I'm missing one. Do not bear false witness. And the 10th, do not covet. Another word for coveting is jealous. Be jealous. The word covet is really not just a jealousy, it's a strong jealousy. It's a greedy jealousy. It is desiring something very strongly. And whenever God was going through those 10 commandments, what did he say? He said, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness. He didn't expand on those, right? I mean, he gave those short words. Thou shalt not steal. 3 words. But whenever he came to that 10th one, thou shalt not covet, he expanded on it. This is what he said. He said, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. Don't be jealous for your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Don't crave your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Don't be jealous for his house. Be content with your own house. Be content with your own spouse. Be content with what you do have. You see, God expanded on that 10th commandment, I think, for a really good reason. He said, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. Those are very simple. Okay, I totally get it. Done, right? Well, it should be that simple, but thou shalt not covet. He gave you examples because I think we needed them. When you see your neighbor's house, 2 stories and a patio, a pool, are you jealous? When you see that coworker of yours who has just this gorgeous wife or that hunky husband, let's say they got a 10 out of 10, but you're sitting at home with a solid 7. I know this is silly, but it's real life. We're flawed human beings. Let's say you see someone with a thriving business, a nice car, high up in a company, nice salary package. How do you feel? It's totally normal to think, oh, they have a nice house. Oh, they have a good-looking spouse. Oh, that person's doing well. And I think it's kind of normal to say, yeah, I wouldn't mind that. I would like to get to that point with the house, not with the wife, or spouse. Don't upgrade, be happy, be content, you know what I mean? But with the house, you'd be like, yeah, I would like to have that one day, and we need to save up for it. But when you start desiring that to the point where you're just focused on it, you're going to be frustrated and angry. When you are focused on the thing that you don't have or can't have, you're just making yourself frustrated. You have to tell yourself, you have to rein in your desires. You have to have the self-reflective moment where you say, I don't need to desire that so much. I don't need to think about it so much. It's only going to make me angry because we have to focus on the things we do have. Focus on the things that's in our control. I mean, because I've heard one person say, he said, I wake up every morning in a bed that's too small, driving my daughter to a school that's too expensive. I go to work to a job for which I get paid too little. And I'm thinking to myself, he sounds so bitter. You think that's a happy person? And I think I also want to note here with Cain, right? With all the emotions he's feeling, I think there's a little bit of sadness here, right? Because it says, why are you angry? There's the anger. And why has your face fallen, right? He's hanging his head low. I feel like hanging your head low is more of a sign of sadness and shame rather than anger. I think there's a little bit of a mix here of emotions, right? It's not just jealousy and anger. I think he's just in this rough spot where all the emotions in his heart are being tangled, right? He's jealous, yes. He's angry, yes. But I think maybe he's also angry at himself. He's depressed that he failed, right? He's ashamed, he's humiliated, he's embarrassed. And I'm not excusing his actions, understand that. But I'm saying he's struggling right here. Now, we can probably relate to being overwhelmed, to feeling 20 different emotions all at the same time, to being tempted to take all of it out in the wrong way. But at the end of the day, he is angry. And that Hebrew word for anger means he's burning with anger. And anger by itself is not a sin. Some people think it is. It's not. God gets angry. Jesus got angry. The problem is what you do with it. And the problem with anger is it makes you not think, right? It makes you just act. It makes you less self-controlled. Whenever you have all that energy and passion building up in you, what do you do with it? Or do you think first? And because when God said this, right, this rhetorical question, why do people ask rhetorical questions? I just did it, right? Why do people ask rhetorical questions? And in your mind, you're thinking to yourself, why do people ask rhetorical questions? When God asked this question, why are you angry? The idea is Cain had to stop and think. Like, Cain had to ask himself, why am I angry? And you know what that makes him do? That makes him pause. That makes him stop. It makes him breathe a little bit. You remember, I don't know if you were taught this as a kid. When I was taught as a kid, when you're angry, you breathe in, you hold it for 10 seconds, you count to 10, and then you let it out. And then you respond. Why? Because with anger, you just want to go now. You don't want to think. You just want to act. That's the problem. Cain, why are you angry? Respond to that, right? And Cain, ideally, Cain would think, well, I'm angry because of this, because of this, because of this. And in talking it through and thinking it through, he would come to understand the truth. He would come to realize that I really don't have a really good reason to be angry, or maybe my anger is directed at the wrong person. Like for you, when you're angry, you have to ask yourself, why am I angry? Do I have a good reason to be angry? How angry should I be? Should I just be a little bit angry? Should I be a lot angry? How do I express this anger in a constructive way? What do I do with this anger? Those are really good questions to ask. And that'll keep you out of a lot of sin. There's this verse right here. God here is trying to gently guide Cain into some self-reflection. This is a great verse. Be angry and do not sin. The Bible says you can be angry, just don't sin. And one way to do that, don't let the sun go down on your anger and give no opportunity to the devil. It's like you can be angry. It's okay to be angry. Sometimes there's really good reasons to be angry. But in your anger, don't do anything that wouldn't please God. And one of the ways you do that is don't stay angry. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. What he's saying is, don't be angry for long stretches of time. Don't hold a grudge. Don't be bitter. Diffuse your anger. Take a step back. Because Satan loves an angry person. Here, the devil, when you're angry, that's an opportunity for him to get into your heart. When you aren't self-controlled, that's when Satan is the strongest. And here, Cain had to learn this the hard way. This next rhetorical question, again, God trying to get Cain to think. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And one thing is verse 7, depending on your translation, it'll say different things because verse 7 is one of the harder verses to translate from Hebrew in the book of Genesis. So literally, that word accepted, it means swelling, elevated, dignity. It can mean accepted, but literally what it would say is, if you do well, there will be a lifting up. That's all it says. It's not really a complete sentence. Hebrew's funny like that. If you do well, there will be a lifting up. And it's like, lifting what? Is he lifting his sin and forgiving it? That could be, because he's going to talk about sin next. What I like to think is, if you do well, you will be able to lift up your head. Because his head is down. Shame, humiliation, frustration, depression. And he says, Cain, if you do what's right, you're going to be able to hold your head up high. And I like that idea. You're going to be able to hold your head up high, saying, if you do the right thing, you don't have a reason to be humiliated, embarrassed, or sad. Before Cain commits this terrible evil, God sees this potential in him. God's saying, Cain, there's a better future for you. Just because you failed here doesn't mean you're a failure. Just doesn't mean you're doomed to failure. Just because this offering wasn't accepted doesn't mean the next offering won't be accepted. God's saying, Cain, you're in control here. Just because you make God mad doesn't mean He's always going to be mad. Just because you failed here doesn't mean you're always going to be failing. With God, there is always this path to redemption, where God says, you'll get it next time. Again, that fatherly advice. When you're struggling, this is really good to remember, that even God says, hey, you'll get it next time. I remember really early in my ministry, I was still going to school for it. And in Lubbock, there were a lot of people asking for change. There were a lot of homeless in Lubbock, Texas. And I bonded with this one couple, Jason and Amy. They were homeless about half the time. And I was going to school. I was eating ramen every day. I barely had enough to pay the bills as is. But when they came by and asked for help, I would help them. I would put them up in motels. I would go to food banks to be able to cover it. In the motels that they were stuck in, they weren't really nice. Notorious for being a place you go down the hall and buy some drugs. And Jason was a recovering addict. They both were. And they were determined to stay clean. They went to work every day, one of those works where you get paid for the day. This was probably one of the hardest things I had to deal with because they got to the point where the wife was prostituting herself for the money so they could eat. There was this one time where they called me and they asked me to come pray with them. They sounded really upset, so I came over. Jason wouldn't look me in the eyes. I knew something was wrong. And Amy said, he went down the hall. He was really frustrated. I told him not to, but he went down the hall. And I asked a couple questions, and he relapsed. He wouldn't look me in the eye, and he was in tears. I mean, he was hanging his head low. And I didn't know what to say. I'm 21. I've never been in this situation before. I did the only thing I thought I could do. And I praise God. I think it was God helping me know what to do in that instance, because I didn't know what to do. And I put my arm around him. I said, I love you. You'll get it next time. Things happen. Don't beat yourself up. God forgives you. I praise God for the wisdom to be able to know the right thing to say. And I feel like this is kind of one of those instances. Cain, I know you didn't do right. I know you're embarrassed. I know you're humiliated. And it's like he's beating himself up. And when someone's beating themselves over the head, you don't need to beat them over the head. When they know they did the wrong thing, you don't have to keep reminding him. God didn't need to come rebuke him because he already knew. Instead, God said, you can do this. If you do well, you won't have to struggle with all this stuff. If you do well, you don't have to hang your head low. And in this, what he's trying to establish is that idea of personal responsibility, that you control yourself. That it doesn't matter what the world does to you. It doesn't matter what circumstances are. The one thing you can always control is yourself. That's really the only thing at the end of the day you can control. And that goes with your emotions too. Even whenever you're overwhelmed with emotions, you got to separate yourself until you gain that self-control back. And he's saying to Cain, Cain, you're in control here. You control how this turns out. You control the results. You're hanging your head low. You're frustrated and angry because of what you did. And that may not be what you want to hear, but it's what you need to hear, because that means next time you can do better. He's saying, you're in control. You don't have to be upset. You don't have to do things that make you sad. We're endowed with this free will to be able to resist our desires, overcome our weak nature, and do what is right. And when you do that, you're going to live a better life. And I'm going to start going a little bit quicker through this. One of the really unique things that God says to Cain here, right? You remember how in Genesis 3, it was Satan coming in the form of the serpent, coming and tempting Eve? Well, here it's not Satan. We know Satan's heavily involved, and I'm sure this is Satan here, but God doesn't talk about Satan here. This is the first mention of the word sin in the Bible. It was Satan coming after you, but now it's sin coming after you. Sin is personified. It's not a real living thing, but it's treated like a living thing just to explain how terrible it is. The very first mention of sin is portraying it like a monster on the prowl. Sin is crouching at the door. What's he trying to say here? That idea of crouching. I think it really speaks to, how a tiger gets really low right before it's about to pounce. It's crawling, it's sneaking up. It's ready to make its move. That's the idea with sin here. It's at the door, meaning it is right next to you. It is about to get in. It hasn't yet, but if you open the door, it's in. Cain still has a chance. But right now, sin is ready to pounce. And this isn't the last time you find sin personified in the Bible. Romans chapter 6, 7, and 8 personify sin a whole lot. And when the Apostle Paul talks about sin, he doesn't talk about it like a monster. What he talks about it is like an evil slave master. That when you sin, you are a slave to sin. And when you work all day, you know what you get for a payment? You know what your wages are? Death. It's an evil slave master who's just going to kill you. It's a trickster. It's a deceiver. It is this thing that possesses you, almost as if it infects you and takes over your body. And whenever it gets inside you, no matter how much you want to try to do the right thing, sin is making you do the wrong thing. But Paul says, through Jesus, you're free from sin. Through the sacrifice of Jesus and the faith in it. Paul says, as if sin was on trial, when Jesus died on the cross, it was Jesus condemning sin. That when you connect with Jesus in the death, burial, and resurrection, when you are baptized in faith of that, you are free from sin. You're free from the slave master. You are free from the consequences, that murderer, that trickster, the monster. You see, Jesus is always knocking at the door, right? So is sin. And God is giving Cain this warning. He says, Cain, you got two paths laid out in front of you. If you do well, it'll be great. But if you don't, it's going to be worse. Its desire is contrary to you. Talking about sin. Now, this is kind of a little bit difficult to translate. I guess technically the best translation would be its desire is against you. So the idea is that sin wants you, but not in a good way. Sin wants you in the way of an evil slave master. in the way I want you for myself so I can use you however I want and I don't care about what you want. This is kind of like an abusive relationship here. How he wants you, or like the prowling wild beast. Again, he wants you, but just to consume you. You see, sin is not going to take you to a 5-star restaurant for a nice evening. Not going to walk you home like a gentleman. Sin is the concept of everything that God hates. And you know what? You might have a good time at first, but then you're going to realize that it's abusive. And by the time you learn the hard way, it's going to be really hard to separate yourself from it. James portrays sin as something that our desires give birth to. And so it's like sin is your own child who grows up and kills you. Sin is something that harms you. Sin is your idea with major consequences. God says sin comes from our desires. Well, guess what? Sin desires you. And this is really a warning. Because when you're angry and you're frustrated, when you're filled with emotion, sometimes you need this warning. When you see someone who's angry and about to do something wrong, they need a warning. But again, it ends on hopeful. He says, sin, its desire is contrary to you. Its desire is against you. It wants you in a bad way, but you must rule over it. God has not lost hope in Cain. Isn't that amazing? He says, Cain, you can do the right thing. No matter how monstrous sin is, Cain, you can rule over it. You know, God gave mankind dominion, control over everything. And the most important dominion we have, the most important control we have is control over ourselves. It says, Cain, you can do this. See, it's important to confront people when they're in the middle of sin. That's really important, but it's not enough. We have to then follow it up with encouragement and say, I know you're struggling right now, and I know you've done something wrong, but you can do this. That no matter how big the monster is, no matter how big the problem in your life, you can do this. God is emphatic here in the pronouns. You must rule over it. Cain hasn't lost this freedom of choice. It's not as if his path is laid out for him that he has to take. He still has this opportunity to move beyond the anger, to forgive. His doom is not inevitable. He is capable. And that's important for you to remember too. It's not doom. You still have an option. As long as you live and breathe, you have the option to get rid of this anger, to move beyond the problems, to tackle the problem in your life. And God's going to help you. God's going to give you the tools. It doesn't matter how big how large that beast is on the other side of the door. It doesn't compare to God. You see, Cain serves as a really good example. And when you're frustrated, when you're angry, come to this verse. Come to Genesis 4, verses 5 to 7. And Cain, he gets mentioned throughout the Bible. 1 John, he comes up and he says, Cain is a good example of what not to do. He says, this is the message that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one, Satan, and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. You know, if you read the rest of the chapter, what you find is God ultimately cursed Cain after he murdered his brother. God said, you're going to wander the earth. The earth is no longer going to give you fruit. You're not going to be able to farm anymore. And Cain says, this is too much. What if someone tries to take vengeance on me? And God says, fine, I will put a mark on you, whatever that mark is, so that people know that you won't be harmed, and anyone who harms you, I'm going to harm them even worse. And it's weird to me how that ends, right? When God said, don't worry, to the murderer. When the murderer said to God, God, I need help. I mean, you might think God would say, well, this is your doing, deal with it. But God is gracious and loving. He says, Cain, don't worry. No one's going to come after you. I'm going to make sure of it. God comforted the murderer. God comforted the person who failed twice. Because even in God's punishment, you see God's grace. Because God didn't take Cain's life, even though he probably could, right? Even though I think he would been completely just to do it. But God instead, he's protecting him. And Okay, I don't know if this is what God meant to do, but I can kind of see an analogy here, right? So you got Cain, who didn't please God, and he killed his brother, who was an innocent shepherd, and then he was punished, and then God marked him. I don't know if this was intentional. Maybe God orchestrated the events to do this, but there might be an analogy here. Abel was the shepherd who pleased God, and even though he was completely innocent, he died. That sounds a lot like Jesus. Completely innocent, the shepherd of our souls, and he died. Jesus became human. He's our brother in humanity. Like Cain, we failed to please God. And so our failure to please God, our sin, is why Jesus died. We effectively murdered Jesus. And while God could have punished us way worse, He was graceful. He showed us grace, and instead He marked us. And I would say our mark is the blood of Christ. Now, I don't know if I'm stretching things to make this analogy, but I can't help but see the similarities here, regardless of the analogy. I want you to consider God's words to Cain. I want you to consider how sin is always at the door, but God says it's your duty to rule over it, that effectively your job is to rule yourself, to be self-controlled. And when you fail, Jesus releases us from this monster of sin, and God is here comforting, supporting, and encouraging us. When you're in the position of Cain, listen to God's love, to His comfort, His truth, His warning, and His encouragement. And when you see someone in Cain's position, do what God did. Go to the person in love. Give them comfort. Share with them the truth. Gently give a word of warning. Encourage them to do the right thing. Because we all know what this is like. And the final question I have for you, are you in a moment like this right now? Is sin knocking at the door right now? Do you find yourself just so overwhelmed with emotions like Cain? Are you angry? Or is your face fallen? Are you hanging your head? God's here, and we're here for you. The elders are going to be in the back, and I'm going to be here in the front. If you find yourself in the place of Cain, answer the invitation as we sing this next song.